The inheritance was not stolen with violence, but with paper. That was the first thing she understood, sitting in the lawyer's office that smelled of old leather and dust. The cold was not from snow outside the door, but from the chill of the document placed before her. It was a trust amendment dated 3 days after her father's funeral. The signature at the bottom was not his. The notary stamp beside it was from a county 200 miles away, where her stepmother's brother happened to be a commissioner. The injustice was not a loaf of sawdust bread, but a portfolio of assets worth $4,200,000. Legally transferred through a series of filings that felt, in her hands, like forged prison bars. They did not cast her into the woods. They left her in the house, technically. They gave her the east wing, the one with the persistent damp smell of mild no cleaner could erase, and an allowance of $600 a month. Described in a separate memo as for maintenance of her person. The cruelty was in the precision, it was systemic. It was the locking of a door she hadn't even known needed a key, the quiet reassignment of her future into columns on a spreadsheet she was never meant to see. Her stepmother's perfume, something floral and expensive, still hung in the air of the main rooms, a scent that now meant exclusion. The sound was not of a bolt sliding home, but of a banker's polite cough on the phone when she asked to verify the terms of her own trust. The touch was the smooth, cold surface of the lawyer's mahogany desk as she leaned forward, her fingers leaving no mark. Her presence already being erased from the legal narrative of her own life. They had taken the company shares, the rental properties, the investment accounts. They left her with the smell of mildew, the sound of distant laughter from the family dinners she was no longer invited to, and the cold, clear understanding that her grief had been someone else's opportunity. The battle would not be fought in a forest or a castle. It would be fought in filing cabinets, in database queries, in the minute discrepancies between one version of a form and another. She looked at the forged signature, she felt the weight of the paper, and in that quiet, chilled office, she stopped crying. She started calculating. The east wing smelled of trapped time. It was the scent of old books left too long in damp air, of wool carpets that had absorbed decades of winter chill and never quite released it, of the faint, sweet rot of cut flowers left too long in a vase no one remembered to empty. This was her kingdom now, 6 rooms at the back of the house where the sunlight only reached for 2 hours in the late afternoon. Painting weak, yellow rectangles on the floorboards before fading away. Her allowance arrived on the 1st of each month, $600 deposited electronically. The number appeared in her banking app with a soft digital chime that felt like an insult. It was enough for groceries if she bought the store brands, enough for utilities if she kept the heat at 64 degrees, enough for nothing else. The sound of the main house was a constant, low hum through the walls, the clatter of fine china being laid for dinner parties she wasn't invited to. The murmur of her stepmother's voice on business calls, discussing assets that should have been hers. The bright, empty laughter of her stepsisters coming home from shopping trips. She could map their movements by sound alone, the heavy front door closing. Footsteps on the marble foyer, the distant chime of the elevator going up to their rooms. Her own space was silent except for the tap of her fingers on her laptop keyboard late into the night, and the occasional rustle of paper as she sorted through the boxes of her father's old files she'd salvaged from the attic. The physical reality of her reduction was in the touch of things. The rough texture of the second-hand wool blanket on her bed, nothing like the smooth linen she'd grown up with. The cold metal of the kettle she boiled for tea, a cheap thing from the discount store that whistled too sharply. The feel of her father's old ledgers, the leather covers worn soft at the corners, the pages inside filled with his precise, sloping handwriting detailing business dealings from 20 years ago. She would trace those numbers with her finger, feeling the slight indent where his pen had pressed into the paper. That was her connection now, not to the living family in the other wing, but to the ghost of system and order he had believed in. She drank tea that tasted faintly of dust, made from bags bought in bulk. She ate simple meals at the small table by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the overgrown garden that no gardener tended anymore. The hunger wasn't for food, it was for context, for meaning, for the story behind the numbers on the trust amendment. The cold wasn't from the weather. It was the chill of being made a ghost in your own home, present but unseen, existing in the negative space of someone else's design. She would lie awake at night, listening to the house settle and feel the vast, empty quiet of being erased. But in that quiet, she began to listen more closely. She learned the schedule of the cleaning staff, the day the gardener came, the time the mail was delivered. She noticed which lights were left on in which rooms, and for how long. She observed the comings and goings of delivery vans, noting the names of the companies. It was a different kind of survival, not in the woods, but in the architecture of neglect. Her fingers didn't bleed from weaving. They ached from typing, from holding a pen for hours as she copied figures from one notebook to another, building her own private map of what was gone. Her broth wasn't simmering on a hearth. It was the thin, careful understanding she was brewing in the silence, ingredient by ingredient, fact by lonely fact. The personal loss was a door. The systemic theft was the whole way beyond it. She began to understand this in the third week, when the first bank statement arrived for an account she hadn't known existed. It was addressed to her father, care of the house. The balance was zero. The account had been closed 2 months prior with a transfer out of $120,000. The receiving account number was unfamiliar. This was not an emotional crime, it was a procedural one. The trust amendment she'd seen was just the visible tip. Beneath it lay the machinery of transfer, a sequence of forms and authorizations that moved value from one place to another with the cold logic of plumbing. Property law was the first system. Her father's will had been superseded by the living trust, a common enough instrument designed to avoid probate. But trusts have rules. They require trustees to act in the beneficiary's interest. They require proper documentation for amendments. They have filing requirements with county recorders. The forgery on the amendment was one violation. The failure to file it properly with the county clerk was another. The failure to notify her as a beneficiary was a third. Each was a crack in the legal facade. Banking regulations were the second system. Large transfers trigger reports. Accounts require signature cards. Changes of ownership on safe deposit boxes need notarized forms. The zero balance statement suggested a transfer that should have left a trail, a series of digital footprints across banking servers. The money didn't vanish. It moved, and moving money requires permission, codes, routing numbers, all logged somewhere. Tax law was the third system. Inheritances have tax implications. Trust distributions generate tax forms. Property transfers change the basis for capital gains. The IRS would have received copies of certain documents. Their records were another potential map, one built for collection, not for justice, but a map nonetheless. She laid the pieces out on her desk, the forged amendment, the zero balance statement. A property tax bill for a commercial building she remembered her father owning, now addressed to a limited liability company with a name she didn't recognize. The smell in the room was no longer just mildew and dust. It was the scent of ozone before a storm, the electric tang of systems colliding. The sound was the rapid clicking of her keyboard as she researched state trust law, Uniform Commercial Code articles, Banking Secrecy Act provisions. The touch was the dry texture of printed legal statutes, pages and pages of dense text that she had to learn to read like a new language. Her stepfamily hadn't just taken her money, they had used the very systems designed to protect property to steal it. They had turned the locks against the rightful owner. This changed the fight. It was no longer about convincing them to be fair. It was about finding the procedural error, the missed filing, the improperly executed document, the regulatory violation that would force the systems to reverse the theft. The law, in its abstract, mechanical way, didn't care about her tears, but it might care about a defective notary stamp. The bank didn't care about her loneliness, but it might care about a transfer that violated its own internal compliance rules. The tax authority didn't care about her family drama, but it would care about unreported income. Her survival now depended on understanding these systems better than the people who had weaponized them against her. She wasn't gathering firewood. She was compiling case law. She wasn't building a shelter. She was constructing a legal argument, one citation at a time. The cold reality was no longer the temperature in her room. It was the chilling efficiency of the theft, the way it leveraged trust and law against itself. But that efficiency was also its weakness. Systems leave records, procedures create paper trails. Every form filed was a potential receipt, every authorization a potential point of failure. Her future hadn't disappeared into a void, it had been moved through a series of bureaucratic doors. And she was learning, finger by aching finger, how to pick every lock. Her skill was not in magic, but in pattern recognition. It began with the bleeding of her fingers, not from a loom, but from the sharp edges of countless sheets of paper. She requested copies. Every document she could think of. The complete trust file from the lawyer's office, which arrived in a heavy cardboard box smelling of photocopier toner and faint mildew. Her father's last 3 years of tax returns, obtained through a formal request to the IRS that took 6 weeks to process. Bank statements for every account she'd ever been associated with, going back 5 years. Property records from the county assessor's office, printed on thin, cheap paper that left paper cuts. She spread them across the floor of her largest room, creating a landscape of financial history. The smell was of dust and ink and her own sweat as she worked late into the night. The sound was the constant rustle of pages, the scratch of her pen in a notebook, the soft tap of calculator keys. The touch was the dry, unforgiving texture of legal paper, the sticky grip of neon-colored tabs she used to mark anomalies. The growing callus on her right middle finger from holding a pen for 8, 10, 12 hours a day. She learned to read the documents not for their stated purpose, but for their shadows. A bank statement showed not just transactions, but patterns of behavior. Large transfers always happened on a Friday afternoon. Property deeds were filed consistently 30 days after the purported trust amendment date, suggesting a coordinated schedule. The notary stamp on one document had a commission number. She looked it up. The notary's commission had expired 6 months before the document was signed. That was a crack, a small one, but real. She found another. A wire transfer authorization form required 2 signatures under the bank's rules. Only one appeared, her stepmother's. The bank's own compliance department had missed it, or had been encouraged to miss it. She compiled these discrepancies in a ledger, her father's old accounting book now repurposed as a map of fraud. Each entry had a date, a document reference, the nature of the discrepancy, and the potential violation it represented. State notary law. Federal banking regulation, uniform trust code. Her fingers ached, her eyes burned from the screen's blue light. She drank bitter tea to stay awake, the taste of cheap leaves and desperation. She ate cold sandwiches at her desk, barely tasting them, her mind tracing columns of numbers instead. This was her weaving, the threads were data points. The loom was her understanding of how systems were supposed to interlock. The bleeding was literal, from 100 tiny paper cuts, and metaphorical. From the exhaustion of seeing her father's legacy reduced to a puzzle of violations. But with each cut, each hour, each noted discrepancy, the fabric of the theft began to show its weak seams. She wasn't cooking a feast. She was preparing a case. The broth simmering was her growing expertise, reducing vast complexities down to actionable facts. The heat wasn't from a fire, but from the focused intensity of a mind learning to see what others had overlooked. The competence she built was silent, invisible to the house around her. They heard only the quiet rustling from the east wing, assumed it was the sound of surrender, of a girl sorting through old memories. They didn't understand it was the sound of an ode, it being born. Her hands, marked by paper and ink, were learning to trace the contours of a crime that had been designed to look like bureaucracy. And in that tracing, she began to find its shape. The helper came not from the woods, but from the basement of the county records building. His name was Mr. Harris, and he was 74 years old. He had worked for the county clerk's office for 47 years, first filing paper deeds in giant leather-bound books. Then later, supervising the digitization of those same records. He had retired 3 years ago, but came back twice a week as a volunteer, helping researchers navigate the labyrinth of microfilm and database queries. She found him one Tuesday morning, sitting at a scarred wooden desk near the archives, a magnifying glass in one hand. A cup of terrible-smelling institutional coffee at his elbow. The room smelled of old paper, ozone from the microfilm readers, and floor wax. She had come looking for the original filing of the trust amendment, the one that should have been recorded with the county to be valid. The digital index showed nothing. She needed to see the physical logbooks from that period, in case the filing had been misfiled or logged under a wrong name. Mr. Harris watched her for 20 minutes as she struggled with the heavy logbook, her fingers smudged with old ink. He didn't offer help immediately. He observed. He saw the careful way she turned the pages, the notebook where she wrote down references, the lack of frustration in her face, only a quiet, dogged persistence. Finally, he cleared his throat. The sound was dry, like pages turning. "You won't find it that way," he said. His voice was soft, but carried in the quiet room. They changed the indexing system in 2012. Anything filed in the 6 months before or after might be in the transition log. It's not digitized. It's in the back, on green paper. He stood slowly, joints creaking, and led her to a metal cabinet in a corner. The smell here was sharper, of metal and dust. He pulled out a binder filled with faded green sheets, handwritten entries in columns. "Here," he said, "look by date, not by name." The system was chaotic then. They were trying to learn the new software. Things got missed. She found it on the 3rd page, a trust instrument, filed by her father's law firm, dated 5 years earlier. It was the original, unamended trust. The amendment was not listed. Its absence was a fact, a cold, hard fact. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, looking at her not with pity, but with a kind of professional recognition. "You're auditing," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. He gestured to the empty chair at his desk. "Sit. I know how they bury things here." He spoke for an hour, in that slow, measured voice. He explained how certain law firms had paralegals who were friendly with certain clerks. How filings could be delayed, misfiled, or logged with minor errors that made them hard to find later. How the statute of limitations for challenging certain filings started from the date of recording, not the date of the instrument. If a filing was delayed, the clock started late. He showed her how to read the clerk's stamps, the tiny initials that indicated who had processed a document. He pointed out that the notary's stamp on her copy of the amendment had a different font from the one used by the notary whose commission number it bore. A small thing, but in his world a significant thing. He was her woodcutter, his axe was knowledge of a system's hidden pathways. His kindness was not emotional, but professional. He respected the work. He saw someone doing the hard, tedious labor of truth-finding, and he offered his map. He didn't ask for her story, he asked for the document numbers. He didn't promise justice, he promised to show her how the filing cabinets breathed. For the next several weeks, every Tuesday and Thursday, she would bring him a list of document references, property IDs, names of LLC. He would disappear into the archives and return with photocopies, or with a shake of his head and a note explaining why the record didn't exist where it should. His help was the smell of photocopier toner and old coffee, the sound of his slow, precise explanations. The touch of the documents he handed her, still warm from the machine. He was overlooked because he was old, because he was a volunteer, because he sat in a basement. But he knew the architecture of the bureaucracy better than anyone who had ever worked in the shiny offices above, and he gave her the keys. The knowledge from the basement archives connected to the patterns in her ledger. It was no longer a collection of strange facts. It was a mechanism, Mr. Eris found the missing filing for the original trust. He also found a curious thing. A quitclaim deed for one of the commercial properties, filed 6 months after her father's death. It transferred the property from the trust to a limited liability company called Crestwood Holdings. The grantor's signature was her stepmother as trustee. But the notary acknowledgement was defective. The notary had stamped it, but the journal entry number in the county's log didn't match the notary's own recorded journal, a small break in procedure. But under state law, a defective acknowledgement could make the deed voidable. It was a thread. She pulled it, Crestwood Holdings. She searched the Secretary of State's business database. The registered agent was a law firm she didn't recognize. The members of the LLC were not listed. That was allowed for single-member LLC in their state, but tax filings would reveal the owner. She filed a request with the State Tax Commission, citing her interest as a beneficiary of the original trust that had owned the asset. It would take time. Meanwhile, she cross-referenced the bank statements. 2 weeks after the quitclaim deed was filed, a wire transfer for $1,800,000 left the trust's main investment account. The memo line said, property distribution, Crestwood. The receiving account was at a different bank. She couldn't see into that account. But she now had a sequence, a defective deed, a transfer of title, a large wire of money. The money didn't match the property's assessed value, which was closer to $2,500,000. It was as if $700,000 of value had simply vanished between the deed and the wire. She mapped it on a timeline using colored pins on her wall. Each pin was a document. Each string between them was a connection, a transfer, a date. The wall began to look like a spider's web with her stepmother at the center, but the web was made of paper, not silk. The smell in her room was now a mix of paper dust, ink, and the faint metallic scent of the pins. The sound was the soft tap of her keyboard as she entered data into a spreadsheet, building a financial model of the theft. The touch was the smooth plastic of the pins, the rough texture of her wall where she'd tacked up dozens of pages, the cool glass of her computer screen. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was reverse engineering a crime. Each small victory, each discovered discrepancy, was a brick in a foundation. She used her understanding of the systems not to plead, but to probe. She filed a complaint with the State Notary Commission about the expired commission number. It was a regulatory shot across the bow. She received a confirmation letter. The matter was under review. She filed a query with the bank that had allowed the single signature wire transfer, citing their own dual signature policy. She received a form letter saying the matter would be investigated. These were not dramatic confrontations. They were bureaucratic nudges designed to trigger internal reviews, to create files, to generate more paperwork. She was fighting with paperwork. Her trade was audit, her weapon was the discrepancy report, her armor was the statute book. She was building a case not for a courtroom yet, but for the internal compliance departments of the very institutions that had been used in the theft. She was turning their own rules against them. The glimmer of a plan began to form, not a plan of attack, but a plan of pressure. If she could prove enough procedural errors, enough regulatory violations, the systems themselves might start to reverse the transactions. The bank, fearing a fine, might claw back the wire. The county, upon review, might invalidate the deed. The notary commission might revoke the notary's license, casting doubt on every document they'd stamped. It was a slow, grinding strategy. It required patience. It required an exhaustive attention to detail that would break most people. But she had been forged in the quiet of the East Wing. Her fingers were calloused from the paper. Her eyes were calibrated to the fine print. And she had an ally in the basement who knew where the bodies were buried, not in the earth, but in the filing cabinets. Her fight was not the first of its kind. She learned this in the historical collection of the city library, in a section few people visited. The smell there was of old bindings and the faint, sweet decay of paper a century old. The sound was the whisper of pages turning in absolute quiet. The touch was the brittle, delicate feel of newsprint from the 1920s, the smooth microfilm reader controls under her fingers. She was looking for context, for precedent. She found it in the archives of the local newspaper. In 1924, a widow named Elena Vance had her husband's hardware business stolen by his brother through a forged power of attorney and a corrupt probate judge. The brother had used the legal system, the banking system of the time, the property registry. Elena had fought back not with a lawyer because she couldn't afford one, but by learning the rules herself. She had petitioned the court directly in neat handwritten briefs. She had tracked down the original power of attorney document and proved the signature was traced. She had found the bank ledger showing the brothers' withdrawals before the probate was even finalized. It took her 7 years. She won. The business was returned, though diminished. The brother was not jailed, but was publicly disgraced. The story was a small article on page 6, next to advertisements for shoe polish and radio sets. In 1958, a similar case. A young man cheated out of a family farm by an uncle who had him declared mentally incompetent. The young man, from his room in the county asylum, taught himself property law from books donated by a sympathetic librarian. He wrote letters to the state medical board, challenging the competency evaluation. He mapped the farm's title history, showing the uncle had filed a fraudulent lien to force a sale. After 4 years, the uncle settled, giving back the farm in exchange for dropping the complaints. The story was a human interest piece titled, "Boy Outsmarts the System." She read these accounts not as ancient history, but as instruction manuals. The tools changed. Forged paper gave way to digital signatures. Bank ledgers became database entries, but the mechanism was the same. The powerful using the systems of ownership and law to dispossess the vulnerable. And the vulnerable fighting back by mastering those same systems, by finding the crack in the procedure, the flaw in the form, the violation of the rule. These were her ancestors in spirit. They had no magic, they had persistence, they had attention to detail. They understood that the system, for all its bias, had a logic, and that logic could be turned against those who broke it. Her stepmother was not a unique monster. She was a type, a recurring character in the long human story of property and inheritance. The greed was the same. The methods were updated, the defense therefore had to be updated too, but the principle was timeless. The law does not protect the weak out of kindness. It protects them when their claim is procedurally perfect, when their paperwork is in order. When they can prove the violation of a rule the system itself claims to value. Elena Vance had proven a signature was traced. She was proving a notary stamp was defective. The boy from the asylum had proven a lien was fraudulent. She was proving a deed acknowledgement was invalid. The historical layer gave her cold comfort. It meant her suffering was not personal failure. It was part of a pattern. It meant her strategy was not insane. It was a proven, if difficult, path. It meant the feeling of being erased by paperwork was a feeling generations had felt before her, and some of them had won. They had won by doing exactly what she was doing, by becoming a better archivist of their own lives than the thieves were. By treating the crime not as an emotional betrayal, but as a series of administrative errors, by outlasting, outreading, outdocumenting their opponents. She left the library as the winter afternoon faded. The cold air outside smelled of car, exhaust, and coming snow. But she carried a different kind of cold inside now, the cold, clear certainty of history. She was not alone. She was following a path worn by the desperate and the diligent across 100 years. And that path led, however slowly, however painfully, toward a door marked justice. The competence became a physical thing. It lived in her hands, in her eyes, in the very rhythm of her days. Her fingers no longer bled from paper cuts. They had grown tough, the skin thickened from handling countless documents, from the constant friction of pen on paper. But they ached with a deep, persistent tiredness, a tendon strain from hours of typing, of writing, of holding pages up to the light. Her eyes no longer burned just from screen glare. They had learned to skim, to focus on the anomalous detail in a field of text, to spot the mismatched font, the inconsistent spacing. The number that didn't align with the column, it was a sensory shift. The smell of her room was now permanently infused with the scent of her work, the dry, woody smell of legal pads, the sharp, chemical tang of highlighter ink. The faint, metallic odor of the old filing cabinet where she kept her growing archive. The soundscape had changed too. The distant noises of the main house were still there, but they were background now, like distant traffic. The foreground sounds were hers, the decisive click of a binder closing, the satisfying rip of a perforated page being torn from a legal pad. The soft, rhythmic tap of the spacebar as she formatted another document, the occasional sigh, not of despair, but of concentration broken and resumed. The touch of things held new meaning, the weight of a 3-inch thick binder full of bank statements, heavy with evidence. The cool, smooth surface of a USB drive containing scanned documents, a tiny vault of facts. The rough texture of the corkboard on her wall, now pocked with hundreds of pinholes from her timeline. The tactile satisfaction of sliding a newly annotated page into a clear plastic sleeve, sealing a fact away for safekeeping. She had routines. She woke at 6. She made tea, the same cheap blend, its smell now associated with the start of work. She reviewed her task list, handwritten in a notebook, each item checked off with a firm stroke of the pen. She spent the morning on active research, sending emails, making phone calls, visiting the records building to see Mr. Harris. The afternoons were for analysis, for staring at the patterns on her wall, for writing up her findings in clear, unemotional prose. The evenings were for deep study, for reading case law, for understanding the nuances of a new regulation. She ate at her desk. She slept when her eyes refused to stay open. Her body was a tool she was honing for a single purpose. The hunger was still there, but it was no longer for the food of the main house. It was for the next document, the next connection, the next piece of the puzzle. The cold was still there, but she barely felt it. She wore layers, moved constantly, kept her mind burning with the work. Her stepfamily saw less and less of her. They might catch a glimpse of her crossing the back garden, a stack of folders in her arms, her face set in concentration. They dismissed it as a hobby, a pathetic attempt to stay busy. They didn't see the transformation. They didn't see the girl who had been soft with grief hardening into a forensic instrument. They didn't hear the new certainty in her step, the quiet authority in her voice when she spoke to a clerk on the phone. They didn't smell the ozone of a mind generating its own energy. Her skill was not showy. There was no beautiful dress, no magnificent feast. There was only a room full of paper, a wall full of connections, and a woman who had learned to read the secret language of systems. And in that quiet, uncelebrated work, she was building something far more dangerous than a protest. She was building a case. Brick by brick, fact by fact, violation by violation. The theft was not an isolated family crime, it was a symptom. Mr. Harris found the next piece. It was a lien filed against another of the commercial properties, this one still technically in the trust's name, according to the county records. The lien was for $250,000 from a company called Metro Supply. It was filed 3 months after her father's death. The curious thing was the timing. The lien was filed 1 day before the trust amendment that transferred the property out. And Metro Supply, according to the Secretary of State database, was owned by her stepmother's cousin. The smell in the record's basement was of damp concrete and Mr. Harris's old wool sweater. He pointed at the document with a bony finger. "See that," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "They create a debt. They file a lien to make the asset look burdened. Then they transfer it out of the trust for a low price, citing the debt. The debt gets paid to their own company. The asset is clean. The money circles back to them. It's a shell game." She felt the cold not of the basement, but of understanding. This wasn't just greed. It was a pattern of corrupt business practice. The stepfamily wasn't just stealing from her. They were using the same techniques to extract value from the family assets, perhaps from other ventures too. The societal layer opened up. This was about more than inheritance. It was about how people with inside knowledge and no ethics could manipulate legal and financial systems to strip assets, to create false obligations, to move wealth in circles that always ended in their own pockets. It was a small-scale version of what happened in corporate raids, in predatory lending, in certain types of tax avoidance. The tools were liens, LLCs, trusts, wire transfers. The victims were anyone on the outside of the circle. She was just the closest victim. She began to look outward. She searched for other liens filed by Metro Supply. She found 3 against small businesses in the next county. All were settled quickly for amounts just under the lien value. She looked for other LLC with the same registered agent as Crestwood Holdings. She found 2. Both had been involved in property flips where the purchase price was suspiciously low compared to assessed value. The connections were tentative, circumstantial, but the pattern was there. A network of entities, family connections, and transactions that smelled of systematic extraction rather than honest business. The sound of her work changed. It was no longer just the rustle of her own documents. It was the hum of the public internet as she searched business registries, court dockets for civil cases, property transfer databases in other counties. The touch was the smooth glass of her larger computer monitor, now constantly filled with multiple windows of data. The societal implication was clear. Her stepfamily's greed had a methodology. They weren't just spending the stolen inheritance on luxury. They were using it as capital to fuel this small-time predatory system. They were building their own little empire on fraud. This changed the stakes. It wasn't just about getting her money back. It was about exposing a mechanism. It connected her personal injustice to a larger societal ill. The people who ran Metro Supply and those other LLC were not victims. They were accomplices or beneficiaries. The woodcutter in the basement had given her an axe. Now he had shown her that the forest was much bigger than she thought, and it was full of similar, carefully hidden traps. Her fight was no longer just personal restitution. It was becoming a forensic audit of a small, corrupt network. And in that audit, she might find leverage far beyond what her own stolen trust could provide. She might find patterns of behavior that regulators or even prosecutors would care about. The quiet virtue of her detailed work now had a darker, broader purpose. She was not just mapping her own loss, she was mapping a blueprint of exploitation. The trap would not be a poisoned apple, it would be a perfectly formatted complaint. She began to design it in the 10th month after the first external response arrived. It was a letter from the State Notary Commission. They had completed their preliminary review. The notary whose stamp appeared on the trust amendment had, in fact, allowed their commission to lapse 6 months prior to the signing date. Using an expired commission was a violation. A formal hearing was scheduled. The notary would be required to produce their journal. This was the first domino. If that notary's journal didn't contain an entry for that document, or if the signature in the journal didn't match, the amendment's notarization would be invalidated. An invalid notarization on a trust amendment could void the amendment itself under state law. The entire theft rested on that amendment. She held the letter. The paper was crisp, official. It smelled of bureaucracy, of toner and cheap paper. But to her, it smelled like ozone after a lightning strike, the first crack in the dam. Now she had to engineer the pressure. The systemic trap had multiple components, each relying on her specific skill, her forensic accounting. Component 1 was the notary commission. She had already triggered that. Component 2 was the bank's internal compliance. She had filed her query about the single signature wire transfer. She received a second letter, this one more serious. The bank's internal audit department was reviewing the transaction. They requested a copy of the trust document and the wire authorization. She provided them with the original trust from the county records and highlighted the missing second signature on the authorization form she had obtained via subpoena from the bank's own archives. Component 3 was the defective deed acknowledgement on the Crestwood property. She drafted a formal complaint to the county recorder, citing the state statute on defective acknowledgements making deeds voidable. She included a side-by-side comparison of the notary's stamp font from the county log and the stamp on the deed. Mr. Aris had helped her get the exemplar. Component 4 was the lien from Metro Supply. She filed a request with the court to examine the validity of the lien, arguing it was a fraudulent encumbrance filed in bad faith to depress the asset's value before a related party transfer. She attached the business records showing the family connection. Component 5 was the tax implication. She wrote a detailed letter to the IRS, not accusing but inquiring. She explained that assets had been transferred out of a trust to related parties at below market value, and she was unsure of the correct tax treatment for capital gains and gift taxes. She asked for guidance. It was a masterstroke. The IRS might ignore a claim of theft, but they would never ignore a potential underpayment of tax, especially one involving related parties and valuation discounts. Each component was a separate strand of the web. Each relied on a different system's own rules. The notary commission cared about its authority. The bank cared about its compliance record. The county recorder cared about the integrity of the land records. The court cared about fraud on the court. The IRS cared about revenue, None of them cared about her personally, but they all cared about their own procedures being violated. And she could prove the violations with documents. The trap was not violent, it was administrative. It would not spring quickly. It would unfold slowly as each bureaucracy processed her complaint, conducted its review, and reached its own conclusion. The pressure would come from multiple directions at once. The stepfamily would not face a dramatic confrontation. They would face a drip feed of official letters, requests for documentation, notices of hearings, inquiries from tax authorities. They would have to defend their actions not to her, but to the very systems they had manipulated. And in those defenses, they would have to produce more documents, tell more stories, create more records. Each new record would be another potential point of contradiction, another receipt for her audit. The smell of the trap was the smell of her room now, of paper and ink and certainty. The sound was the whisper of pages as she assembled the complaint packets, the click of the stapler, the seal of an envelope. The touch was the weight of the packages ready for certified mail. She was not setting a feast, she was serving subpoenas, she was not sewing a stifling dress, she was weaving a net of procedure. And she was using her trade, her hard-won skill in forensic document analysis, to tie every knot. The waiting was its own kind of work. The complaints were filed, the letters were sent. Now there was silence. Not the silence of the East Wing, but the deeper, more profound silence of bureaucracies turning their wheels. She kept her routines, the smell of morning tea, the sound of her own breathing in the quiet room. The touch of the same pen, its plastic body worn smooth from use, but the focus of her work shifted from active hunting to vigilant preparation. She organized her evidence into binders, one for each component of the trap: the notary binder, the bank compliance binder, the defective deed binder, the fraudulent lien binder, the tax inquiry binder. Each binder had tabs, a table of contents, a summary memo written in clear, unemotional language. She made copies. She stored the originals in a fireproof lockbox she bought with a small portion of her allowance, a tangible investment in her own future. The smell of the new binders was of fresh plastic and paper. The sound was the crisp snap of the rings closing. The touch was the cool, smooth surface of the laminated covers. She practiced explaining her case. She would stand in her room and speak to the wall, laying out the chronology, pointing to the key documents, anticipating questions. She rehearsed her tone. Calm, factual, unwavering, she was not a victim pleading. She was an auditor presenting findings. The emotional cost of the wait was a slow drip. Some days doubt crept in. The systems were vast, slow, often indifferent. What if the notary lied in their hearing? What if the bank brushed it under the rug? What if the county clerk dismissed her complaint as trivial? The hunger she felt now was not for food, but for resolution. The cold was the chill of suspended animation. But she had her rituals to ward off the doubt. She would review her timeline, trace the connections with her finger, feel the solidity of the pins on her wall. She would read the historical cases again, reminding herself that time was on the side of the meticulous. Elena Vance had waited 7 years. She had waited less than one. She began to notice subtle changes in the house. The sound of her stepmother's voice on the phone became sharper, more clipped. She heard her arguing with someone, the words unclear but the tone strained. A registered letter arrived for her stepmother one afternoon. She saw it on the hall table, the bright orange sticker screaming for attention. Her stepmother snatched it up, her face a mask of controlled irritation. The smell of her perfume seemed stronger, more desperate, as she passed by the East Wing door later that day. The stepsister's laughter was less frequent. The house felt tighter, like a drum skin being stretched. They didn't know the source of the pressure yet. They just felt the first tremors. She observed it all from her quiet corner, saying nothing. Her own preparation was a kind of armor. She ate her simple meals, she drank her tea. She exercised in her room to keep her body from stiffening, the sound of her own footsteps on the floorboards, a steady, patient rhythm. She slept, and when she dreamed, it was not of castles or balls, but of filing cabinets opening in endless corridors, and of finding in each drawer a single, perfect, incontrovertible fact. The trap was set, the mechanisms were in motion. Now she had to be still, to be ready, to be the calm center around which the storm of official correspondence would soon swirl. Her fingers, resting on the closed binder, did not ache, they were poised. The conflict arrived not with a shout, but with a summons. It was a formal letter from the family's lawyer, the same one who had presided over the original theft. It was delivered by a courier, a young man in a uniform who handed her the envelope with a neutral expression. The paper was thick, expensive. It smelled of cologne and authority. It requested, in polite but firm language, her presence at a meeting in the lawyer's office in 1 week's time. The stated purpose was to discuss family matters and the resolution of certain administrative inquiries that had been causing distress. The subtext was clear. The pressure from the notary commission, the bank, the county had reached them. They wanted to deal with it. They wanted what she had built, not the physical walls of the East Wing, but the legal and procedural architecture she had constructed around their crime. They wanted it to stop. She read the letter in her room, the afternoon light weak on the page. The sound was the crisp rustle of the expensive paper. The touch was its smooth, heavy weight. She felt no fear. She felt a cold, clear focus. This was the return. The gluttonous villain, feeling the first pinpricks of the trap, was coming to claim the mechanism of her defense. They would not ask nicely. They would threaten, cajole, offer a pittance to go away. They would use the lawyer's office, the suit, the fancy stationery, as tools of intimidation. They assumed she was still the grieving girl from a year ago, easily overwhelmed. They did not know about the binders, the timeline, the historical precedents, the old man in the basement. They did not know about the calluses on her fingers from the paperwork. She wrote a brief, polite reply on plain paper from her printer. She would attend. She signed her full name, the one on the original trust documents. Then she went to her filing cabinet. She took out the master summary, the 10-page document that distilled her entire case into its essential points. She did not bring the binders. She brought the summary, a pen, and a small digital recorder she had purchased for $39. She checked its batteries. The sound of the test recording was a soft, clear beep in the quiet room. She practiced placing it in the inner pocket of her jacket, where it would be invisible but would pick up sound. The night before the meeting, she did not sleep much. She lay awake, not with anxiety, but with mental rehearsal. She went over every possible argument they might make, every threat, every false offer of compromise. She prepared her responses, calm, factual, citing document references, statute numbers, dates. She would not raise her voice. She would not cry. She would audit the meeting in real time. The morning of the meeting, she dressed in the most professional clothes she owned. A simple navy blue dress and a jacket that was slightly out of fashion but clean and pressed. She drank her tea. She checked her bag for the summary, the pen, the recorder. The smell of her own soap, simple and unscented, was a grounding note. She left the East Wing and walked through the main house to the front door. The sound of her heels on the marble floor echoed in the silent foyer. No one was there to see her off. She took a bus downtown. The smell of the city, of exhaust and damp pavement, was a shock after the closed world of the house. The sound was traffic, people, life going on, unaware of her small, momentous journey. She arrived at the lawyer's building, a glass tower that reflected the gray sky. the touch of the cool metal elevator button, the smell of the lobby, all polished stone and air freshener. She walked to the reception desk, gave her name. They were expecting her. The conflict was no longer a distant theory. It was a door about to open, and she was ready to walk through it, not with a sword, but with a ledger. The trap sprang in the lawyer's office. The room smelled of leather, old books, and her stepmother's expensive, cloying perfume. The sound was the low hum of the air conditioning, the soft creak of the lawyer's chair as he leaned forward. Her stepmother sat across the wide mahogany desk, her face a mask of strained benevolence. The lawyer began. He spoke of family harmony, of the distress caused by her recent inquiries, of the desire to find an amicable solution. He offered a one-time payment of $200,000 in exchange for her signing a full release of all claims and ceasing all contact with regulatory bodies. The touch of the offer letter he slid across the desk was slick, the paper cold. She looked at it, then she looked at him. She did not touch the letter. She reached into her bag and placed her own summary on the desk, 10 pages neatly stapled. "This is not a negotiation," she said, her voice calm, clear, carrying in the quiet room. "This is a notification. I have filed complaints with the State Notary Commission, the County Recorder, the bank's compliance department, and the IRS regarding specific procedural violations in the transfer of trust assets. The Notary Commission hearing is in 3 weeks. The bank's internal audit is ongoing. The county has acknowledged my complaint about the defective deed acknowledgement. The IRS has opened a file." She paused, letting the words hang in the perfumed air. The lawyer's face tightened, her stepmother's mask slipped, revealing a flash of pure fury. "You little," her stepmother started, then stopped herself. The lawyer held up a hand. "These are serious allegations," he said, his tone shifting from conciliatory to defensive. "They are based on misunderstandings. The trust amendment is valid. The transfers were proper." She opened her summary to the first page. "The Notary's Commission lapsed on June 15th. The amendment is dated December 10th. The Notary Journal for that date, which I have requested via subpoena for the hearing, does not contain an entry for this document. That is a misdemeanor under state law, and it voids the notarization. Without a valid notarization, the amendment is defective." She turned a page. "The wire transfer for $1,800,000 required 2 signatures under the bank's own policy, which is attached as Exhibit B. Only 1 signature appears. That is a violation of the bank's internal controls and banking regulation E. The bank is now investigating." She turned another page. "The quitclaim deed for the Crestwood property has a notary acknowledgement where the journal number does not match the county's log. A defective acknowledgement makes the deed voidable under statute 12-5-41. I have filed a petition with the court to quiet title." She looked up. Her stepmother was pale. The lawyer was scribbling notes, his pen scratching loudly. The smell in the room had changed. The perfume was now undercut by the scent of cold sweat. The sound was the rapid flipping of pages as the lawyer scanned her summary. "You can't prove any of this," her stepmother hissed. "I have the documents," she replied. "I have the county records. I have the bank's own archived forms. I have the Notary Commission's preliminary finding. And I have a timeline that connects the fraudulent lien from Metro Supply, a company owned by your cousin, to the undervalued transfer of the property." She did not raise her voice. She cited dates, file numbers, statute references. She was not fighting with a sword. She was fighting with her trade audit. Each fact was a brick. Each citation was a mortar. She was building a wall of procedure in front of them, and they had no tools to break it down. The lawyer tried to bluster. He threatened legal costs. He threatened to cut off her allowance entirely. He threatened to have her declared a vexatious litigant. She listened, then responded, "My allowance is documented. Cutting it off would be a further breach of the trustee's duty, which I would add to my complaint. My filings are with government agencies, not civil courts, so the vexatious litigant standard does not apply, and as for legal costs, I am representing myself. My only cost is time, and I have nothing but time. The meeting lasted an hour. By the end, the lawyer was no longer making offers. He was asking for copies of her exhibits. Her stepmother sat in stony, furious silence. The trap had sprung, not with a dramatic capture, but with the cold, undeniable presentation of facts. They had come to take what she built. They left knowing she had built a fortress, and she had just given them the blueprint. The aftermath of the meeting was a sensory shift in the house. The east wing remained her sanctuary, smelling of paper and quiet resolve. But the main house now carried a new scent, the sharp, acrid odor of panic poorly concealed. She heard it in the sounds, the slamming of doors, the raised, frantic voices on the phone, her stepmother arguing with the lawyer, with the cousin who owned Metro Supply, with someone at the bank. The bright, brittle laughter of the stepsisters was gone, replaced by sullen silence. The touch of the air felt charged, like before a thunderstorm. She went about her routines, the morning tea, the review of her task list, the visits to Mr. Aris, who now greeted her with a knowing nod and new pieces of the puzzle he dug up. The county had moved her complaint about the defective deed to the top of the pile. The notary hearing was confirmed. The bank had sent a formal notice to her stepmother, as trustee, requesting a meeting to discuss the wire transfer. The IRS had sent a notice of inquiry. Each piece of official correspondence was a stone dropped into the pond of their complacency, and the ripples were turning into waves. She felt the emotional weight of it in her own body, not as fear, but as a heightened awareness. Her senses were tuned to the cracks in their facade. She saw the delivery of a large box from a storage company, items being removed from the house. She heard the real estate agent's car in the driveway, a discussion about listing one of the commercial properties quickly. They were trying to liquidate, to raise cash, perhaps to pay a settlement or to move assets before they could be frozen. Their greed, which had been their weapon, was now their vulnerability. They were acting hastily, making mistakes. She documented it all. She noted the license plate of the storage truck. She looked up the real estate agent's name and saw they specialized in quick, distressed sales. She added these observations to her timeline, not as legal evidence yet, but as indicators of behavior. The personal cost for her was a kind of hollowing out. She had no space left for the grief of her father or the betrayal of her family. That space was now filled with the architecture of the case. She ate her meals without tasting them. She slept a dreamless, efficient sleep. Her hands, when she looked at them, were the hands of a worker, capable and worn. The relief she had once sought in the quiet of her room was now the relief of a job well done, of a mechanism functioning as designed. The confrontation in the lawyer's office had been a test of her construction, and it had held. Now she had to maintain it, to be ready for the next phase, the collapse. The smell of her own determination was a clean, sharp scent in her nostrils, cutting through the mildew and the distant perfume. The sound of her own breathing was steady, a metronome in the chaos she had orchestrated. The touch of the documents, her constant companions, was a reassurance. They were real, they were true. And they were slowly, inexorably, applying pressure to a fault line of greed and fraud. She was no longer just surviving in the East Wing. She was conducting a siege from within the castle walls, and the walls were beginning to tremble. The collapse began with the notary. The hearing was held in a small, fluorescent-lit conference room at the State Office building. The smell was of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. The sound was the hum of the lights and the dry, official voice of the hearing officer. The notary, a nervous woman in her 50s, produced her journal. It was a bound book with numbered pages. The hearing officer compared the journal entry for the date in question to the stamp on the trust amendment. The journal number on the stamp was 702. The entry in the journal for that date was for a car title transfer, numbered 701. The next entry, numbered 703, was for a mortgage document 2 days later. There was no entry 702. The notary stammered. She said she must have made a mistake in her numbering. The hearing officer asked to see her commission certificate. It had expired as documented. The hearing officer asked if she had notarized the document after her commission lapsed. The notary said she couldn't remember. The hearing lasted 20 minutes. The finding was issued 1 week later. The notary had violated state law by notarizing a document with an expired commission and by failing to make a proper journal entry. Her commission was revoked. All documents notarized by her in the 6 months following her lapse were subject to review and potential invalidation. The trust amendment was specifically cited. It was now officially defectively notarized. That was the first domino. It fell with the soft, bureaucratic thud of a stamped decision landing in her mailbox. The historical layer echoed. Just as Elena Vance had proven the traced signature, she had proven the defective notary. The system, when its own rules were violated, began to correct itself. The second domino fell at the bank. With the notary's commission revoked, the validity of the signature on the wire transfer authorization was called into question. The bank's internal audit, already concerned about the missing second signature, concluded that the transaction did not comply with internal controls. They froze the receiving account, the one belonging to Crestwood Holdings. They demanded the $1,800,000 be returned to the trust while they conducted a full review. The stepfamily's lawyer sent a furious letter. The bank's lawyer sent a colder one, citing their fiduciary duty and regulatory requirements. The money was clawed back. It was not yet hers, but it was no longer in their pocket. The sound of that victory was not a cheer, but the quiet click of her pen as she noted the development on her timeline. The third domino was the county. With the notary's journal proven faulty, the defective acknowledgement on the Crestwood deed was now part of a pattern. The county recorder's office, under pressure from their own legal counsel, issued a notice of intent to void the deed due to the defective acknowledgement. The title was clouded. The quick sale the real estate agent was trying to arrange fell through. The property was in limbo. The societal pattern was unraveling. Metro Supply, the cousin's company, was now under scrutiny because of the fraudulent lien. The court granted her petition to examine its validity. The cousin, facing his own problems, offered to settle the lien claim for a fraction of its face value. She refused. She wanted it invalidated, not settled. The historical precedent held. The boy from the asylum had invalidated a fraudulent lien. She was doing the same. The stepfamily's greed had overreached. They had cut too many corners, used too many expired stamps, filed too many hasty documents. Their own haste, their own desire to grab everything quickly, had created the cracks, and she had found everyone. The collapse was not a single event. It was a cascade of administrative decisions, each one stripping away a layer of their ill-gotten gains. They were not being dragged to a dungeon. They were being buried in paperwork, in compliance reviews, in frozen assets and voided deeds. They were destroying themselves through the very greed that had fueled the theft. And she, the quiet archivist in the East Wing, had simply provided the system with the correct file references. The aftermath of the collapse was not a party. It was a quiet restructuring. The notary's revocation invalidated the trust amendment. Without a valid amendment, the original trust document governed. She was the sole beneficiary. The bank, with the wire clawed back and the amendment void, recognized her as the rightful party. They transferred control of the accounts to her, subject to the ongoing IRS inquiry. The county voided the Crestwood deed. The property reverted to the trust. The court invalidated the Metro Supply lien as fraudulent. The assets were no longer in limbo. They were back in the trust, which she now controlled. The systemic restoration was methodical, procedural. It happened through letters, through updated account statements, through revised title records. The smell of victory was not champagne. It was the smell of the new statements arriving, printed on crisp paper, bearing her name. The sound was the soft beep of her computer as she logged into the investment portal for the first time, seeing the balances that were rightfully hers. The touch was the smooth plastic of new debit cards, the weight of checkbooks with her name embossed. But the victory was not absolute. The IRS inquiry was still open. The stepfamily had incurred tax liabilities from the failed transactions, from the income they had taken. Those were their problems now. She hired a proper accountant, a sharp, quiet woman who understood complex estates. Together they began the work of untangling the mess, of filing corrected returns, of paying any legitimate taxes owed by the trust. It was more work. But it was work of reclamation, not of survival. The house changed. Her stepmother and stepsisters moved out within a month of the bank transferring control. There was no dramatic eviction. They left in the night, taking what they could carry, their departure as quiet and shamefaced as their theft had been bold. She did not see them go. She woke to a silent house. The smell of the stepmother's perfume was gone, replaced by the old, familiar smells of wood and dust, now hers to manage. The sound was the absolute quiet of a space, no longer occupied by enemies. The touch was the cold brass of the front door key, which she now held without question. She walked through the empty rooms. They felt large, hollow, waiting to be filled with a life of her own design. She did not rush to redecorate. She began with the east wing. She opened the windows, airing out the smell of mildew and long hours. She bought a new rug, a simple wool one that felt warm underfoot. She kept her desk, her filing cabinet, her timeline wall. They were not relics of a battle. They were tools of a new stewardship. She would need them to manage what she had won. The peace restored was not the peace of forgetting. It was the peace of order. The wisdom was not mystical. It was practical. She had learned that systems, for all their flaws, contain within themselves the seeds of their own correction, if one knows how to read the manual. She had her future back, piece by piece, but it was a future shaped by the fight. She would not be a careless heiress. She would be a diligent steward, an archivist of her own legacy. The historical layer closed its loop. Eleanor Vance had gotten her business back, but it was diminished. She had gotten hers back, but it was burdened with knowledge. The boy from the asylum had his farm, but he lived alone. She had the house, but it was empty. The happily ever after was a fairy tale. The peace restored through wisdom was a quieter, more durable thing. It was the ability to sit in the morning light in her own kitchen, drinking tea that she had chosen, listening to the silence she owned, and knowing that every document, every account, every deed was in its proper place, and that she had put it there. The quiet was a living thing. It filled the house not with emptiness, but with a soft, palpable presence. The smell of the place began to change. The last traces of mildew were gone, aired out by open windows. The scent now was of beeswax polish on old wood, of fresh linen on the bed in the master bedroom she had finally claimed, of the simple herbal soap she used. The East Wing, her former prison, was now her study. She kept the timeline on the wall, a map of the battle won. The binders were on the shelves, a library of evidence. The desk was clear except for a lamp and a fresh legal pad. The soundscape was hers to compose. In the mornings, the sound of the kettle whistling in the now modernized kitchen. The click of her heels on the clean floors as she walked to check the mail. The distant hum of a gardener's mower, a service she had reinstated. The afternoon sound was often the soft rustle of pages as she read, or the tap of keys as she managed the trust's investments with her new accountant. The touch of things held new meaning, the smooth, cool surface of the marble countertop in the kitchen, which she wiped clean each day. The weight of the front door key in her pocket, a solid, reassuring presence. The texture of the wool blanket on her own bed, chosen for warmth, not just necessity. She drank tea from a proper china cup, one of her mother's set she had found packed away. The taste was the same cheap leaves, but the vessel made it different. She ate meals at the dining room table, sometimes with a book, sometimes in silence, savoring the space. The hunger was gone, the cold was gone, the house was warm, the heat set to a comfortable level she controlled. Her body remembered the strain of the long months, the ache in her hands, the tiredness in her eyes. But now those aches were fading, replaced by a different kind of tiredness, the satisfying fatigue of a day spent building rather than fighting. She took walks in the garden, now tended, smelling of cut grass and damp earth. She listened to the wind in the trees that were legally, undeniably hers. She felt the sun on her face, a simple pleasure that had been obscured by the grey filter of her struggle. The peace was not an absence of feeling, it was a fullness of simple, sensory reality, owned and appreciated. She did not throw parties. She did not buy extravagant things, she paid the bills, she met with the accountant, she read books on estate management. She was, in her quiet way, rebuilding the system her father had left, but with her own safeguards woven in. The personal cost of the victory was a kind of solitude. She had no family left. The friends she'd had before her father's death had drifted away during her year of isolation, but the solitude did not feel like loneliness. It felt like space to think, to breathe, to be who she had become. The girl who cried in the lawyer's office was gone. In her place was a woman who knew how to read a balance sheet, how to file a complaint, how to trace a title, how to wait. The fairy tale ended not with a wedding, but with a woman sitting in a quiet house, the deeds in order, the accounts balanced. The future no longer stolen, but held securely in her own too capable hands. And in that quiet there was a deep, unshakable wisdom. The world was full of systems, and systems could be used to harm. But they could also, with enough patience and precision, be used to heal, to restore, to make whole. She had her proof. It was in the binders on the shelf, in the quiet of the house, in the calm rhythm of her own heartbeat. She had taken her future back, piece by piece, and now she would live it. She received a letter from a woman whose name she did not recognize. The envelope was plain, the handwriting careful. The woman explained that she had heard, through a paralegal at the county, about the case involving Metro Supply and the fraudulent lien. Her own small business had been threatened with a similar lien from a different company, but with the same registered agent. She had been afraid to fight. She asked simply for advice. The smell of the letter was of cheap paper and ballpoint ink. The sound was the soft crackle as she unfolded it. The touch was the slight texture of the paper under her thumb. She did not answer immediately. She went to her study. She opened the binder labeled Metro Supply. She made copies of the key documents, the court order invalidating the lien, the business records showing the family connection, the timeline showing the pattern. She wrote a brief cover letter, not legal advice, just facts. Here is what I filed, here are the documents I used, here is the outcome. She included Mr. Aris's name, the volunteer at the county records. She mailed the package. A week later, she received another letter, this one from a man who owned a duplex. His property had been tied up in a title dispute after a quitclaim deed with a suspicious notary stamp. He had read about the notary commission hearing in the legal notices. He asked how she had found the defect. She went to the notary binder. She copied the state statute on notary journals. She copied the hearing officer's finding. She wrote out the steps. Request the notary's journal via subpoena. Compare the journal number to the stamp. Check the commission expiration date. She mailed it. She did not charge money. She did not offer hope. She offered procedure. She offered the manual. The societal layer completed its arc. The personal injustice had revealed a systemic pattern of exploitation. The victory over that pattern had created a template. The template could be shared. She became a quiet node in a network she did not see, passing documents, citations, strategies to strangers facing similar walls of paper. They were not friends, they were correspondents. The smell of her work now included the faint scent of envelopes and stamps. The sound was the whisper of photocopies being made. The touch was the weight of the packages as she dropped them at the post office. She did not give speeches. She did not start a foundation. She answered letters. She provided evidence. She connected dots for people who had not yet learned to see them. Her own story was not the point. The point was the defective notary stamp, the missing journal entry, the single signature on the wire form, the family-owned Leon company. The point was that these were not unique horrors. They were repeatable crimes, and they had repeatable defenses. The final chapter was not an ending, it was a distribution. She took the blueprint of her audit, the one that had reclaimed her future, and she began quietly to mail it out into the world, piece by piece.